Hi and welcome back to my YouTube channel. In today's video, we are going to be deploying a Spring Boot application as a systemd service. Whether you are using Maven or Gradle, the goal remains the same. That is to make sure your app runs automatically on boot, restarts if it crashes, and operates seamlessly in a production environment. We are going to walk you through the necessary steps from the start to a point where you are able to access your Spring Boot application on a domain name or an IP address or both. All right. So with me here, I have a Spring Boot application. As you can see, it will be serving two routes. That's the home page and the contacts page. So I'll be starting my local server here so that we can see what we have. All right. So by default, the port under which we access Spring Boot applications, that is port 8080. All right. So let me open the local host here. So I can just have localhost port 8080. All right. Alternatively, I can make use of the IP. Both of them give the same page. Right, so I just have two pages. That is the home page and the contact us page. So this is the application that we are going to be taking to production. All right, and by taking to production, we mean we are going to configure this domain name. We should be able to access this web application from this domain name and also from this IP, right? We need to have a few items on check. So from my side, I have access to a Nginx server whose IP is listed here. All right, I'll be using a working directory with a given path, and I'll also configure this domain name, and I'll create a systemd service by this name. All right, so in case you are following along, just ensure to adjust whatever we have here accordingly so as to avoid getting errors. All right, so once we set the record straight, the next thing we'll be creating a build of our application, right? Remember, in Java, we are not supposed to upload the raw files as they are. We need to create a build of that. All right, so the way to do that, I'll make use of the inbuilt terminal on VS Code, right? Let me create the screen and the command to use. Let me just collapse that. So we expect that our build results will be posted here in the targets folder. So the command to use to create a build of our Spring Boot application, we have mvn clean install. Once you have that, press enter and give it time. All right, after a few seconds, we see that our build has been created. This is the file that we have. Let me just do that, right, with the given name. So this is the file that we are going to be uploading to our server, right? Not the whole project files as we see here, right? All right, the next thing will be accessing our server. And in this case, we are going to do it on SSH, and depending with the guidelines given to you by your hosting provider, you should be able to access your Linux server. I'll be accessing my server on SSH. I have basically provisioned an EC2 instance, and I'll be accessing it this way. All right. In case you have a challenge or not sure on how to connect your server on SSH, be sure to drop that comment and we'll be able to assist. The next thing after accessing our server, we need to install Java on the server so that we are able to run the build that we just created. But before installing any service or software in your server, you need to do an update of your package repository. All right. So in this case, I'll do an update and do an upgrade at the same time. This is the command that will help us achieve that. That's an update and then do an upgrade. Press enter. All right. Once that has completed, the next thing should be installing Java on the server. And we are going to do that using this command. All right. So we are going to install OpenJDK version 17. Once that has completed, we need to check if if at all Java has been installed. The way to do that, we can have Java, then check for the version, right? And we see that we have Java installed on our system, right? The next thing will be setting up the document root, all right? Remember from our illustration here, I mentioned that my working directory will be home, Ubuntu, and dtechnologies.co.ke, right? So let me just copy that back to the server here. If I check on my current working directory, I have pwd. I'm currently in home, Ubuntu, right? So my working directory will be created in this same folder, all right? So I can simply have mkdir, that is make directory, then I paste in that name. All right, so basically I'll be uploading my files in here, all right? So in your case, you can set up your preferred working directory and then follow along, right? So in this case, I'll have the server on top, right? So copying the files to the server, we have quite a number of ways. One of them is using SCP. You can use FTP. You can also upload your project to GitHub, then clone the repository here, or whichever convenient way that you have, right? In my case, I'll be using SCP to upload the file to the server. So back to our code editor here, I'll create the screen. I'll talk of SCP. In my case, since I'm using an EC2 instance, I will add the path to the key pair. Then I'll mention the location of the file that we need to copy to the server. So that is targets, then detect. Then I'll add the access to our server. So that is Ubuntu. That's the username I'm using to access the server. Then I need to copy this IP. Then in here, I need to mention the location where I need to copy this jar file. All right. So that should be home, have Ubuntu. Then I have that, right? So just take note that not all paths that are mentioned here are accessible by the given user. So you need to ensure that this path is accessible by this user. Once you confirm that, just press enter and give it time. So in case your server is not from AWS, then you may not need to have this. And in that case, you'll be required to have a password, all right? So once the upload has completed, let's navigate back to our server, right? So let me press on Q. If IRS, then we see our file in here, all right? The next thing will be setting up the right permissions for this directory and this file too, all right? And the way to do that, I will change the ownership of this directory to a common user that is used for our web servers, that is www-data. So we can first of all inspect the current owner of the given directory. Let me just cd back one step, ARS LA, and we see that this directory is owned by Ubuntu and the group Ubuntu, and you can see the given permissions here. So we are going to adjust this slightly, all right? So we are going to change the ownership from Ubuntu to www data. The way to do that, we have sudo. All right, so what this command does is that it changes the ownership of this directory to this user and this group. This -r simply means that the ownership of every other directory or file within this directory will be changed to what we have here, right? So we can simply cd detect, then execute that command, and we see that the file we just uploaded is owned by the new user and the new group, all right? The next thing is changing the permissions attached to our working directory. So let me change directory. So if I ls la, we see we have the permissions that we have here. And for security reasons, we need to adjust this to give the right user the right permissions to do whatever they need to do on this directory, right? So in here, we need to have sudo, we change chmod, we are going to have that permission, and we are going to do it on that directory, right? Let's do that. If we inspect the permissions again, we see that the owner can be able to read, write, and execute, all right? Then the group can be able to read and execute. Then for the others, they are able to read and execute, all right? So the difference between what we had here and what we have here is that others in here had permission to write in this directory, but here they have been denied the permission to write in this directory, right? So that is basically to enhance the security level of our application, all right? The next thing is adding this user to the Ubuntu group so as to allow the web server to access the files and resources that belong to the Ubuntu server. Remember, there are some files that our application might be interacting with that do not necessarily belong to this user, all right? Remember, our application will be writing the logs to some files which do not necessarily belong to this user. So that's why we need to add this user to the Ubuntu group. So the way to do that, we have, all right, so what this does is that it adds this user to the Ubuntu group due to the reason I mentioned earlier. So once we have that, press enter. All right, the next thing will be creating a system D service. All right, this is the service that will be used to manage our application. All right, and we are going to do that by creating a file within the directory where service files are to be stored. All right, so we have sudo. All right, so the service is to be created in this path. Up to that point, then I'll create the service in the file named dtechnologies.service. This might be different in your case, but this path should remain. Once we have that, just press enter. I'll be pasting in some few lines here, all right? So these are the lines that are supposed to create our service, all right? So in here, we define a unit whereby we give the description, that is just any description that you can give. Then there is this line talking about after is equals to network.target. So that should remain as it is. Then in here, we define the service parameters. So for the service parameters, we need to mention the user and the group. So this should remain as it is, right? Then for the working directory, so this should be adjusted to suit the working directory that you have set. So we have set as it is. Then for the exstart, this references the directory under which the binaries of Java are installed. So that should remain as it is up to that point, all right? Then in here, just give the path which has your .jar file, all right? So this should be in line with the working directory, then mention the name to your jar file, all right, as it is. Then the rest of the parameters should remain as they are, all right. Then we also define install here and should be as it is. So the only things that you should adjust in your case are probably the working directory and the exstart. And for the user, ensure to set the user as given, right? So once we have that, let us press Ctrl X, Y, and enter to save. Right, once we create that service, the next thing should be doing a daemon reload. This is to ensure that our server is aware of the service that we just created. And the way to do that, we have sudo systemctl daemon reload. All right, the next thing should be enabling the service that we just created. And the way to do that, we have, all right, by enabling simply means that this service will always be restarted automatically whenever our system reboots. All right. The next thing, let us restart our service. So instead of enable, we have start. Remember, it's a new service, so let's start the service. The next thing should be checking on the status to see if it's up and running. We see that our service is not yet up and running, right? But it's enabled and all that. So we need to investigate why it's not up and running, because that is what we expected, all right? So the way to try and troubleshoot is by checking the logs being generated by this service. And the way to do that, we are going to talk of journalctl. We have -u, then mention the name of the service, right? Then we can have -f. All right, so we see we have, all right, so no such file or directory exists. All right, so we can be able to check to see what is happening. All right, so the directory that we set as a working directory, let me just cd into that. All right, so present working directory, this should be it. Then the next thing we need to confirm is the path that has been set on our service file. All right, so let me just have cat, can have etc, let's have systemd, then let's have system, then we have dtechnologies.service, press enter, right? Think working directory. All right, so in this case we should have .co.ke in here, right? So instead of cat, let me have nano, sudo nano, right? So in here should have .co.ke, all right? Once we have that, press on Ctrl X, Y, and enter to save. So the next thing should be restarting our service. Let me clear the screen first. So to restart the service, let's make use of this command. Let me start, right? So we are told that we need to do a daemon reload, sudo, then paste that, right? Then let me try to start, then check the status, right? Right, still not up and running. We need to investigate. So we still have to learn the command to check on the logs. Right, so error, unable to access jar file. So that should be in home Ubuntu. Right, think everything should be all right. As we had mentioned when setting up the working directory and the extart path, all right, we mentioned that this should reflect the working directory, all right? So we need to adjust that as well. So we need to go back to our file, the service file, right? So in here, we need to adjust this. This should be .co.ke, right? And I believe this is the name to the jar file. So let us just exit, right? Then let's try to restart, do a daemon reload, then start it, then check on the status. All right, so we see that now the service is up and running, right? Let's see if this website will be accessible, right? This should be accessible on port 8080. All right, and we see that our application is now accessible, all right, on the given port. But then we wouldn't want to be accessing the application on this port. We would want to at least access the application on the default port 80 or 443, all right? So this is where Nginx comes into picture. So Nginx web server is going to help us set up a reverse proxy. And by doing that, we'll be able to access our application on just the IP without indicating the given port. All right. So let us go back to our server and do the necessary, right? So in our server, I'll press on Q, then I'll install Nginx. All right, after installing Nginx, we need to set up a file where we are going to add the required lines to help us achieve what we mentioned here, all right? So we are going to create the Nginx file under So this is the path that we should create the Nginx configurations, that is etc Nginx and sites available. All right. Then in here, we need to give our file a name. So in this case, I just give it Spring Boot -web. All right. So you can just give it a name of your choice. All right. Then in here, I'll be pasting in some few lines of code. So in here we have the location. So this basically defines the URL under which our application is accessible on, that is locally. So locally we can be able to access our application using this. Then we are telling this block to listen to whatever traffic that comes in through port 80, then forward it to the domain that we mentioned here. All right. So in here, we can mention the domain as we have mentioned and the IP address as well, all right? Remember, we first of all want to see if we are able to access our application using the IP without mentioning the port. So in here, let me just add this IP, all right? Then in here, I've also included the domain name. These are the domain names that this application will be accessed on, right? So once we have that, press Ctrl X, Y, and enter. Once we do that, the next thing should be creating a symbolic link from what we created to the site enabled directory, all right? So that way, Nginx is able to read from this file, all right? So the way to do that, let me just copy that path. So the way to do that, we have sudo ln-s, we have that, whatever we just created here, then we are linking it with etc, we have Nginx. Instead of sites available, we have sites enabled. All right. Right. So the next thing will be testing if the created configurations are okay, right? And the way to do that test, we have that, right? So the purpose of this is just to confirm that everything is in order, so that in case there was an error in the configuration that we just created, we are able to troubleshoot that before restarting Nginx, right? But once we confirm this, then we can proceed and restart Nginx. All right, so the next thing we'll be doing a test here. Let me just do a test. All right, and we see we can now be able to access our application without mentioning port 8080, right? So that is it, right? So the next thing, we would want to see if we are able to access this application using the domain name here, right? This is the domain name, but currently this is trying to access it from HTTPS. So we are not able to access that at the moment, right? So let me try to access it from an incognito window. So I'll have HTTP, then I'll paste in the domain name, continue to site, all right? And we see that our application is accessible from the domain name as well. And remember, without mentioning the port, all right? So seeing that we are able to access it from the domain name, it's not really a good idea to have your web application being accessible on the domain name, all right? There are quite a number of things that can be done. One of them is blocking the access to this application using this IP, all right? But the ideal one would be redirecting the traffic that comes in through the IP to the domain name. The way to do that, we need to go back to the server, all right? And the same location where we created our Nginx configuration file, we just need to go back there. So in here, we need to create a new block that will talk about server. Then we have this, right? So we are going to talk about we listen to port 80, right? Then we mention the server name here. So in here, we need to mention the IP. So there's the IP in my case. So in your case, just add the IP to your server here, right? Then once we have that, this should return a 301 redirect on HTTP. Mention our domain name. All right. And in that case, we can simply remove the IP here. So what this one does is that any traffic coming in through this port, it will be redirected to the domain name. All right. So let me save that and restart Nginx. So something is not in order. Then I can simply have JohnCTL, I have you, then I mention of Nginx service, right? We see that a high performance web server and a reverse proxy server, something failed, unexpected. All right, so let me just check and see. All right, so let me have a space in here. After server, let me have a space. I think everything else should be okay. All right, so let me save. Y, enter, clear the screen. Let me try to restart it again. Still getting errors. All right, let me go back there. All right, then let me also have a semicolon here. That could be cause some issues. Let me try to save that. Y, exit. Let me try to restart. All right, and we see that we have now been able to restart it. So if we check on the status, right, we see it's active. All right, so the next thing, let's do a test of the changes that we have made. So if I reload this, right, so it's basically trying to redirect to HTTPS. All right, but because we do not have the SSL yet, that's why we get this. I can try doing that from the incognito window. So if I visit that, all right, we see we have been redirected to the domain name. All right, so the next thing that I need to mention is that for APIs, there are times that you may need to have your APIs being accessible on, say, port something here. All right, so all you need is just to adjust the port that we mentioned here. Right, so for instance, we wanted it to be accessible on port 8080. Just adjust that port here and adjust it here. All right, and another scenario is if you do not want to configure a domain name. All right, you only want to be accessing it from the IP under port 80. All you need is to remove this block, then instead of having the domain name here, have the IP address. All right, and by that you are only able to access the application using the IP address, and in this case under the port that you have indicated here. All right, the next thing will be securing our web application using an SSL certificate. All right, and in this case we are going to use the free SSL certificate to secure our domain name. Remember, if we come back here and try to, let me just duplicate this, try to access it on HTTPS, we see that our site is not reachable. All right, and we would also want that whenever we access the not secured protocol of our domain name, it should redirect to the secured protocol. All right, so the way to do that, we need to install the necessary service for issuing the SSL certificate, and the way to do that, we have this command. All right, so you have sudo apt install. We are going to install certbot and python 3 certbot for Nginx. All right, once we have that, press enter. Once that is completed, the next command we need to execute is sudo certbot nginx -d. Then in here we need to mention the domain name that we need to install the SSL on. So in this case, I'll have that, and I'll also have that for the www.domain name. Then press enter and follow the prompts. So in here we need to input our email address, confirm you have read the terms and conditions, give a consent to receive email campaigns, then give a time. All right, and we see that the SSL certificate has been issued successfully. So going back to our domain name, right? So let me just come here. Actually, it has reloaded. If you can see, it has reloaded and is now secure. All right. So let me inspect on this. So we are operating on the not secured one. So let me click on contact, and we see that it has been redirected to the HTTPS protocol. All right. So that's it. It's as simple as that. All right. With just a few commands, we have been able to set up our Spring Boot applications on a Linux server running on Ubuntu. All right. And I hope this video has been helpful. Kindly be sure to give it a thumbs up, drop your thoughts in the comment section, show some love by sharing it with your network, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you and goodbye.